When it comes to drawing, I think drawing from imagination is the end goal for a lot of people, but it's also one of the hardest things you can do. The problem is that drawing from imagination is a completely separate skill from everything else, so you're not going to get significantly better at it over time unless you practice it. That said, it's also very advanced, meaning you need to have a good foundation of all of the other skills like observation, perspective, construction, and only once you have that foundation can you start to learn how to draw from imagination. So in this video, I want to go over some of those fundamentals and then do a drawing from imagination exercise. Now, like I said, you need to have a good foundation before you start learning how to draw from imagination. But at the same time, you also shouldn't wait until you think you have a good foundation, because there's always more stuff to learn and things to improve on, so you can study fundamentals basically forever. And also, if you wait too long with practicing drawing from imagination, you might end up getting too scared to draw from imagination. Because you'll be at a point where you can draw pretty well from reference, but then when you draw from imagination, you're basically starting from square one and you're drawing like a beginner again. Comparing the stuff you can do when drawing from reference to the stuff you can do from imagination might be discouraging, and that will prevent you from actually practicing it. So if your end goal is to learn how to draw from imagination, you should probably start learning as soon as possible. Now, I think the most important fundamentals are perspective and construction. I guess line control too, but that's kind of important for everything, not just drawing from imagination. If you want to draw characters, anatomy is also an important one, but in the hierarchy of importance, I'd still put perspective and construction all the way at the top and anatomy way below that. The reasoning being that drawing from imagination is all about building forms in 3D space, and no matter how much you know about anatomy, if you don't know perspective or construction, it's not going to go well. Ideally, you want to be good at anatomy, of course, but there are only so many hours in a day, and I think perspective and construction are just a way better time investment. Now first, perspective. This is an extremely dense topic and it'll take a lot of time to learn, but the most important concept is that when a set of parallel lines goes into the depth, they converge to a vanishing point. The common example people use are train tracks. Both sides of the tracks are parallel to each other, and this means that when they go into the depth, they converge at a single point called the vanishing point instead of staying perfectly parallel. Every set of parallel lines that goes into the depth will have its own vanishing point. This is where the point perspectives come from that you may have heard of, like 1-point and 2-point perspective. 1-point perspective means that there's only one set of parallel lines that goes into the depth, giving us one vanishing point, and 2-point perspective means that there are two sets of parallel lines that go into the depth, giving us two vanishing points. The vertical lines in this case are not going into the depth, and we draw them perfectly vertical. If the vertical lines are also going into the depth, we end up with three vanishing points, and this is 3-point perspective. But when it comes to perspective, don't try to memorize it as these three perspective systems. That's a common mistake people make. They look at a scene and then they try to identify if this is 1-point or 2-point perspective. Instead, memorize it as sets of parallel lines going into the depth. This means that you can have a scene that's mostly in 1-point perspective, but you can also have an object in this scene that's at a different rotation, and this will have two different vanishing points. And then if there's another object at a different rotation, we'll have two more vanishing points. The reason why we still talk about having a scene in 1-point perspective, for example, is because the majority of objects will probably be positioned parallel to each other. Like if you look around your room, I'm willing to bet that most objects have the exact same rotation, because that's the easiest way to organize a room instead of having things at different rotations. What can help with understanding perspective is studying backgrounds, and specifically buildings. Now what I've been doing is studying a bit of architecture, and currently I'm following Stephanie Bauer's class on Craftsy, who is the sponsor of this video. Craftsy is an online learning community with classes covering a ton of different topics, specifically aimed at creativity. and all of these topics have a bunch of different classes taught by professionals. The drawing and painting categories are the ones that I'm the most interested in, of course. I already talked about Stephanie's class about sketching architecture, which, like I said, makes for some good perspective practice, but outside of perspective, she also talks about things specific to architecture, like the building materials and different architectural elements, which helps with breaking down the form and really understanding it. I also came across Donald Yatomi's sketching for concept art class, and he goes over some techniques and the workflow you could use when coming up with concept designs. Personally, I'm not that into designing my own stuff, but knowing the techniques does help with leveling up your art skills. So even if you're not going to use this, I do recommend learning about it. Craftsy regularly adds new classes, so it wouldn't hurt to check in every once in a while because you might find a class that can help you improve. The first 1,000 people watching this video that use the link in the description or scan the QR code will get a full year of Craftsy's premium membership for only $1.49. This offer is only valid for new members, by the way. But parallel lines converging is one of the most important concepts of perspective because this lets you place things at different positions in the depth, and it's what allows you to keep objects that are supposed to be horizontally aligned, but in perspective. This is really important for when you're drawing from imagination. Because if you draw a 2D diagram first, it'll show you which parts of the object will be horizontally aligned, and we can use vanishing points to draw these in perspective. I realized that this explanation only covered a very small part of perspective. I'll probably make more videos in the future that go over perspective. But in the meantime, the book I'd recommend picking up is Craig Atterbury's Complete Guide to Perspective Drawing, or Framed Perspective by Marcos. Next, we need to go over construction. Construction is a technique where we take simple forms like boxes and cylinders, and then by stacking these on top of each other, we can make more complex forms. The benefit is that these simple forms are far easier to draw correctly in perspective compared to those complex forms, and this helps a lot when we're drawing from imagination. It's really hard to draw a form like the body at a specific rotation because the body has parts that exist at different points in space. But it's not that hard to draw a box at a specific rotation or at a specific angle because at most it's 9 lines. Once you have those boxes in place, you can use those as guidelines to draw the more complex forms. Even if you see somebody go straight to the complex forms and they're not drawing these guidelines, they're able to do that because they're just imagining the simple forms. To be able to visualize them like that though, you need to actually draw them first, and then after doing that thousands of times, you can eventually imagine them. One of the main things you need to keep in mind about construction is that it's not just about drawing a box and then drawing stuff on top of it. Depending on what you're trying to draw, sometimes it's better to just draw a box that encompasses the whole form, and then you can mark landmarks within that box, and this is also where the perspective that we just talked about comes into play again. Because you need to use parallel lines and vanishing points to figure out how your landmarks exist within that box. This is basically a puzzle, and it's kind of mathematical, so if you enjoy that sort of stuff, you'll probably like doing this too. To practice this, I'd recommend just grabbing some random objects and then trying to draw them as simple forms. What's important is that these forms follow perspective. And one problem you might run into has to do with proportions. To be able to draw an object, these simple forms have to be proportioned according to the object that you're trying to draw. If the simple form that you drew is too small, it's not going to help you draw the actual object, for example. Now, there's no easy way to figure out these proportions. You kind of just have to use your intuition, which is why it's really important to practice these simple forms separately, because that will train your brain to be able to manipulate these forms however you want. Now, there are two main exercises that help you with drawing from imagination. The first one is that you find a reference, study it for a minute, then take it away and try to draw it from memory. The second one is that you take an object and then draw it from a different angle. This is the one that I enjoy doing, so we're going to practice this. Alright, so I think this would be kind of a cool prop to draw from a different angle. This is Rudius' staff from Jobless Reincarnation, and I highly recommend you try to draw along with me, so pick up your sketchbook. And also, I do need to point out that I am using a reference for this, which, you know, is the prop design sheet. But just because you're using a reference, that doesn't mean that it's not drawing from imagination. If you're drawing it from a different angle, you're still drawing from imagination. Some people think that drawing from imagination is just having a white surface or, a white canvas and then drawing something completely at random, which that is drawing from imagination as well, but this also requires a lot of designing, which is a completely separate skill, and usually that's something that you have to do beforehand with these, two-dimensional diagrams. The first thing we need to do is just figure out what the form looks like. We have a sphere in the center right here, and the cool thing about spheres is that they are perfectly spherical, or, well, perfectly circular, no matter what angle you're looking at them from. So if we're looking at it from above, it's a perfect circle, and if we're looking at it from below, it's still a perfect circle. Then we also have this metal ring that's surrounding the sphere, and I think this thing is supposed to be a circle, and a circle in perspective turns into an ellipse. The thing about ellipses is that we have a major axis and a minor axis. The minor axis goes through the center of the ellipse, and at that point it creates a 90-degree angle with the major axis. The major axis touches the two widest points of the ellipse, and the minor axis touches the two least wide points of the ellipse. And it looks like with this staff, the minor axis of the ellipse actually follows the body of the staff. So if we draw the angle that the staff is going to be at, we already have the minor axis for this ring. And then I think the hardest part is going to be this top portion, because we're dealing with some angled surfaces. But for simplicity's sake, or just as a guideline, I think what we can do is draw all of these as straight lines, and then we just make them a bit more curved once we add the actual line work. And then one more thing that stands out to me is that the front of this staff has a vertical alignment like this, where these 2 points touch this vertical line. The angle I'm thinking of doing is something like this, where it's kind of being held upside down. Alright, first thing we need to do is figure out the angle that the staff is going to be at, which I think keeping an angle like this is more or less fine. Then we think about how long the staff is going to be, so proportions basically. It looks like this top portion is about 1/3 the length of the whole staff. I think it's a bit shorter than that, but if we think about it like it's 1/3, that should be more or less fine. So first thing I'm going to do is mark where this line is going to be. And then from there, I can figure out where the halfway point is. Should be right around here. I made this a bit bigger because this is getting foreshortened into perspective. So that's going to be smaller. And then same thing with this part. It's going to be a bit smaller. So we have 1/3 here, 1/3 here, and then the last third would be, I think, about here. Then the next thing would be, I guess, figuring out where the sphere is going to be. It looks like the top of the sphere is about halfway down the entire length of that whole section. So that should be right around here. And then the sphere itself is a bit smaller than the entire length of it. So I think if we mark this point, then we have the entire sphere, maybe a bit bigger, maybe like that. And then remember that a sphere in perspective is just a perfect circle, no matter what angle you're looking at it from. So just try to fit a circle inside of that. But yeah, I guess the next thing would be the ring. Again, the center of the ring is in the center of the sphere. And then we already have the minor axis because that's the body of the staff. So we have the center of the sphere, which is right there. And then the major axis is at 90 degrees to the minor axis. So that would be the major axis. And then I think I'm going to draw the rest of this whole top portion next. We don't need to draw all of the tiny details. Like you can see this little piece here in the back. It's made up of a bunch of different angles. I think the best thing we can do is just simplify the whole thing to a straight line. And then once we have that guide in place, once we do the actual line work, that's when we can figure out where the planes need to be. So we're going to start with that triangle at the top. I kind of want to have this at an angle too, similar to how this one is rotated. So not a direct front view, just kind of a 3/4 view like that one. And then another proportion thing is that the back of the triangle sort of lines up with the edge of the sphere. It goes a little bit past it. So what we can do is from the bottom of the triangle, we can just draw a line straight back to this line, which goes a little bit past the edge of the sphere. And then from here, we draw another line that goes down, giving us this piece, and then one line that goes in like that. And also, don't forget, the front of this whole thing has a vertical alignment like that. So once we have that vertical line, we can just draw our 3 lines like that. So we'll do that. And then now we'll say that one line is here. This would be the bottom piece. Then our triangle goes back this way, a little bit past the edge of the sphere, which will give us the second line. And then this one goes like that. And then same thing on the other side. This goes a little bit behind the edge of the sphere, because this also goes towards a vanishing point. If you want to figure out where to place the mirrored point, by the way, you just have to use the vanishing points. And to figure out how this line is angled, you kind of have to think about the whole form in terms of a box. I think in this case, our staff is kind of rotated like this, and you can see that these lines are angled like that. So we have to think about these lines being angled the exact same way. So we know one point is over here, then this goes down, then from here we draw another angle like that, intersects there, and then we can just connect this over here, and then that gives us the, I guess, base of the whole triangular form. In terms of proportions, it looks like the ring is about... well, it's a little bit wider than the width of the sphere, or it looks to be about as wide as the sphere. So I think what we can do is just take the width of the sphere that we have and kind of extend it a little bit. So do that. And then from here, we would draw the entire ellipse. Now the width of this ellipse also varies based on what angle we're looking at the object from, because if you have an ellipse like this and you have an ellipse like this, and then we can also have an ellipse like this, the more we're seeing of the top plane of that ellipse, the more it looks like we're looking directly at that top plane. Because with this ellipse, it looks like we're kind of looking at the side of it. So the width of the ellipse determines the angle, and I think this width looks about right. You kind of have to play around with it a little bit and use your intuition to figure out what looks right. But I guess once we have all of this, we have basically all the guidelines we would need to make the whole form. So let's see what the eventual form looks like. And that does it for the video. So if you guys enjoyed it, be sure to leave a like. Let me know in the comments what else you want to see in the future. And if you'd like to support the channel, you can do so through YouTube memberships, which are linked in the description. And then we also have a Discord server where you can get advice from other artists, or you can just talk to other artists, which is also linked in the description. But I guess I'll catch you all in the next video.